that, okay, you mentioned that in Job, and I think you were talking about 40, maybe verse 2 or 3 or something, that you thought it had been edited. And I understand why it might have been edited, since it was a kind of a, as you suggested, an attack on Deuteronomy. What would have been in there if they had not edited that way, do you think?
The story would have just ended with Job, having things restored to him. And there would have been the open-ended question regarding God's justice.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe the Deuteronomists couldn't tolerate that open-ended question about God's justice. And so, just to make the matter perfectly clear, they say, the message is, were you there when I created the world? Were you there with what I know and you think you know? As if to say, God's justice is immutable,
Mm-hmm.
and God's justice is ultimately unknowable in any eternal sense of knowing God's justice. We
Mm-hmm.
might know God's justice in a temporal sense, as I think I've mentioned this before. When I was a kid growing up, and I would yell at my mother, and then I would storm out of the room and stub my toe, and she'd say, "God punished you." And so there's like, we have our own ideas or fantasies or ways of talking about God's justice in a temporal sense, right? Mm-hmm. Here in our limited scope of experience in this realm in which we are living. But then there's the eternal understanding of God's justice. And the writers of Deuteronomy, and I think, want Job, the story, ultimately to end with something declarative about that, which stands in contrast to what I think is the ultimate purpose of the book of Job to begin with, which is to say it is an open-ended question. It remains an open-ended question. And as I have to say, when the book, one of the most popular, widely read, translated books in the world, When Bad Things Happen to Good People, when Harold Kushner wrote that book, he, also in a sense, echoed the message of the Job writer, not the Deuteronomy writer, in saying, that we have that proverbial term, blank happens. And that's part of what was in Kushner's book. Bad things do happen to good people. Good things happen to bad people. It's not a simple equation. And things can happen that, at least on our level of understanding, may have no eternal consequence whatsoever. It's just blank happened. And I think the writers of Job, wanted to give that message, particularly to a people that had gone through a whole string of historical traumas and exile and civil war, etc. And because, the human proclivity is, we need to blame someone. And I think Job was giving credence to the voice of human exasperation in the face of pointless suffering, as opposed to the Deuteronomists, who are all about, if you're suffering, you may not know what it is, but it's for a reason. It's related to something you did before. It's, Jewish karma. I mean, we don't really talk about it in those terms, but what goes around comes around. Follow the mitzvot. I mean, it's so clear in Deuteronomy, in a section that in progressive synagogues is read on Yom Kippur morning. In traditional synagogue, we read about the high priest and the scapegoat and the Yom Kippur ritual. But in progressive synagogues, they read right from Deuteronomy. I place before you life and death, blessing and curse. Choose life so that you and your descendants will live. I mean, it's a very clear equation. If you choose life, you will live. Choosing life means observing the mitzvot. And we find that throughout the Hebrew Bible, but that also was a reflection of their scientific view of that time. There was a lot of magical thinking, a lot of inability to understand natural phenomenon they saw around them. It was we have to be honest, it was very primitive in so many ways, but also very advanced at the same time in so many ways. So it's an interesting question, and it's one for which the dialectic will never end. And ultimately, if you live long enough, you're going to have trials and tribulations, and we all eventually have to have a conversation within to determine how we're going to react to those trials and tribulations and how we respond to them. So I like to say, I grew up as a child of Deuteronomy. And I'm now somewhere living in between Job and Deuteronomy.
Thank you very much for clarifying.
What does that mean, somewhere between? That's very curious.
Because there are some days where I see things happening in my tiny little sphere of life that just feel to me to be more than just coincidental, that feel that there's some other mystical content attached to these experiences, or the way things turn out against all odds, or so that I step back in a state of what Abraham Heschel would have said, radical amazement. And in that state of radical amazement, I'm thinking, maybe someone is involved. And then I'm like, nah, because I don't really want to believe that fully, because then I'm stuck having to accept, why babies are born with cancer and other tragedies happen. So I'm going to say these certain events have mystical content. God's playing with me. But I don't want these to be in that category because they make me uncomfortable. So sometimes I live in that Deuteronomy space, or I do think everything I'm living through is consequential and connected to some divine pattern or purpose. And then the rest of the time, and it's probably the majority of the time, I'm in the world of Job, where blank happens. And not sure it has anything to do with God at all, other than the fact that God gave me the faculties to make the best of it. So it's like living in a continuum.
I can see why you had trouble in bar mitzvah school.
Yeah, they didn't know what to do with me. They had difficulties because I wanted to talk about this when I was 7. It's a problem for them.
No, that's great. I mean,
So, well, shall we begin? Or we just began? Let's say our bracha for study, which is the normal bracha, the formula for all of the brachot, and it ends with la'asok b'divrei Torah, which means to busy ourselves with the words of Torah. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav, v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
All right. So I am going to pull up the screen. And we're going to start right here. All right, can everyone see the blue background?
Yes.
So we're going to do just a brief review from last time on a couple of things. And to put Kabbalah in perspective, one of the beauties of Jewish tradition is we have so many different sources that we turn to gain understanding that have presented themselves over the course of time, written sources. And the original source of Jewish knowledge, Jewish understanding, both of the mitzvot and of God, is found in the Torah, the 5 books of Moses.
I can't hear.
And this is called Torah
I
Sinai.
can't hear.
Are your speakers turned off?
Are we okay?
Unmute.
Can you hear?
Alt A.
Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. So Torah Sinai, God had a moment of revelation on Sinai, and this is what we consider it, in a sense, the source of the written Torah. Torah Bichtav is the written Torah containing the 613 commandments. We also have what's called Torah Sheba'al Peh, the oral Torah. The oral Torah is the midrash, stories, commentaries, the Talmud, explanations of the 613 commandments that occur in the written Torah. And traditional Jews believe that on Mount Sinai, not only was the written Torah revealed, but the oral Torah as well. But it wasn't fully articulated until generations later. And then we also have what's called Torah HaSod, the secret Torah. And, so this notion that we have first an explicit event in history where God's word becomes known on Sinai, it then becomes transmitted for the first time into the written form of the 5 books of Moses, into our Sefer Torah, and then it is iterated again in the oral Torah. It's manifested with more commentary and more explanation. And then we are taught, even with what we have from Sinai, even with what we have in writing, even with what we have with all the commentaries and traditions, there's still a dimension of Torah that remains secret. At the deepest level, at a level of understanding that we would say only God has, that the Torah itself is a mystical document, and we humans read it from a certain perspective, but if you can imagine it, God reads it from a different perspective. And that perspective from the divine attitude is what is called Torah HaSod, the secret Torah. And that's what Kabbalah is all about. Kabbalah is about taking us through a journey from the explicit to the secret when it comes to studying the Torah. And so the rabbis eventually developed this notion of layers of meaning, layers of understanding. And, there have been, I'm sure there's a few dissertations out there that have been written that talk about where Freud, from what roots did Freud develop his ideas of the different layers of consciousness, the different parts of the human psyche, from the conscious to the pre-conscious to the unconscious, levels of how we operate consciously in the world. And that is very similar and incredibly amazing that the rabbis were talking about that very idea 2,000 years ago. When they talked about layers of knowledge or layers of consciousness, they talked about first, you open a Torah scroll, you read the words, what's written there, the literal meaning, what's printed on the page, that's called Pashat. Pashat. And we then have the remez. What are the words implying? Are there things not written that the words suggest? And then they say, then there's an even deeper level, and this requires the imagination, called the drash, the metaphorical meaning, where we use stories to explain stories, to explain stories, to explain stories. And then once again, the rabbis acknowledged, and then on the deepest level is the sod, the secret. And again, to reiterate, Kabbalah is designed to take us through Peshat, Remez, and Drash to get to the sod, to get to the secret. And it's interesting, they turn this into an acronym with the word prosdor, from prose, P-R-Z-D-R, prosdor, the Peshat, the Remez, and the Drash. The prosdor is considered like the hallway. And we study Torah, we go into the hallway, and as we go further into the hallway, we open the doors and we find deeper understanding. But ultimately, there's a level very difficult to access, and the way to access it, if at all, is through Kabbalah. Now, there are different types of Kabbalah, 3 primary types. It's worth reviewing because a question was asked that I want to speak to at this point. There's what we've been looking at, theoretical Kabbalah. It's an intellectual endeavor. It's studying Kabbalistic texts and trying to get deeper knowledge into the sod, into the secret. There's also spiritual meditative Kabbalah. And we talked a little last time about the role of meditation in general, because meditation as a discipline can lead to a kind of emptying of the mind, of creating like a non-spatial space inside your head. And when people go into deep meditation, people enter a space of almost like non-being. They're not aware of the outside world around them. Their sensory awareness is reduced, and they become, it's like getting tuned into a certain kind of frequency. And when one is tuned into that, one experiences a kind of emptying of the mind. Now, that's not the only method of meditation. Much more popular these days is called mindful meditation, where we don't empty our minds, but we look at the thoughts that flow in our minds like clouds passing by, and we try to still enter into a state of relaxation and meditation. In Kabbalah, the role of meditation is exactly the same as in other spiritual disciplines. It's just in Kabbalah, there are words, particular words and phrases that are considered, because of Kabbalistic belief, to have a certain spiritual evocative power. And people will meditate utilizing these words like mantras, or they will meditate on a word from the Torah, or they will, so it's just, they're emptying their mind except for one focal word or even a focal letter of the Torah or a form of God's name. People will do Kabbalistic meditation and focus on the word Yahweh, on the Tetragrammaton. They will do breathing related to these spiritual words. I can honestly tell you, I've never engaged in this kind of meditation. I've read about it and I've had people tell me about it, and it can be very, very, very powerful. But it assumes, and I'm going to use this word, a spiritual posture. We usually think about meditation and physical posture, but there's a spiritual posture involved in Kabbalistic meditation. And of course, it probably won't surprise you that one of the most common words utilized in Jewish meditation is Shema. The first word of Shema Yisrael. And so there is this meditative practice related to Kabbalistic thought. The third is magical Kabbalah. And as I said last time, this is the stuff that conspiracy theories are made of. And, this is belief that Kabbalistic ideas can be applied to alter the state of the universe. The building of a golem in medieval times is a reflection of magical Kabbalah. To animate a dead body, to perform acts on the Sabbath that Jews are prohibited from doing, and potions and incantations and amulets. We have a whole tradition related to that. It's a wonderful tradition. Something as simple as, I'm sure you've seen, the Hamsa. A Hamsa, the symbol of a hand, which is, it's the Shekhinah guarding a person. And oftentimes there'll be an image of an eye of God's providence imposed sometimes on a Hamsa. And so we do have this magical kind of Kabbalah as well. And, my feeling is that anything a person does symbolically to engage with the universe that enhances one's sense of self as well as connectedness to the universality of the universe, it's all good. Question? Oh, you're showing a Hamsa, Kim? Thank you. The term Kabbalah literally means received, referring to received tradition. And it is an implied idea that the mystical teaching represents the true interpretation of the Torah. Now, I want to show you this quote because I found it this week, and I think it's just really worth discussing what this means. And we're going to step off from just looking at the content. Daniel Matt, who's a wonderful scholar who makes Kabbalah accessible, said a true Kabbalist is continually reinventing herself or himself in what he or she is receiving through the traditions. This is the great phrase: by continual inspired leaps of sacred imagination. And that phrase, sacred imagination, I want to pause now. I want to open that up for a little conversation. What do you think that means? What do you think that is? Sacred imagination.
Yeah, everybody's muted mostly.
Now I can see everybody. Sacred imagination.
So
yeah.
Rabbi, in Breshit, the Almighty talks about creating the world, the universe, and then he endows mankind with the ability to speak our world into creation, because he says that he created us in his same image, and he spoke the world into existence. Sacred imagination could also be us accessing the sacred and the imaging for the creation of our own being.
I really love what you just said, because you took a very literal interpretation in breaking the phrase down, sacred, and then the word image.
Yes.
And it's interesting. We say God has no image. You can't see my face and live. And the commandment against making, images of the divine. And yet here we have a reference to sacred imaging of something in our minds. And maybe we can start by saying it's not about imagining what God looks like.
Correct.
Which is really interesting, because in Christianity, they resolve that problem of who and what God looks like. They resolve it. They make God incarnate in a human form in the character of Jesus. So sacred imagination in Christianity is very different than in Judaism, because sacred imaging in Christianity is very literal and concrete. Sacred imaging or imagination in Judaism, wow, something very different. What I will say is a clue to understanding sacred imagination is the very thing that atheists argue against.
Rabbi, maybe it has something to do with and I'm going to just talk about it in terms of how I feel when I meditate, is basically focusing on the essence of the divine, but the vehicle of my body. I mean, I sort of sense things through my own whole sensory being and mind. So the sacred imagination is being able to focus for me on the divine and the different ways in which the divine manifests, and allowing myself to go beyond what I feel sensorily is sort of my human boundaries. And it's a leap of faith, really, in trying to understand the divine energy while I'm in human form. That's how I could explain it in terms of what I feel. But
Rabbi,
Yes, Sharon.
2 things. I'd like to pose a question. Is not all imagination sacred?
that's a,
Good
I
question.
mean, we have the divine spark. Therefore, our imagination is a sacred faculty. Number 1.
I would agree with that.
Great
Okay,
question.
thank you.
Ra- Ra-
And
But
I
that's
have
the thing.
another thought I'd like to share. I don't know how all of you feel, but particularly in terms of what we are discussing, if we could begin to be conscious of not referring to the Almighty in male form, I would appreciate that very much.
Thank you for reminding us.
Rabbi,
Yes.
my problem is that the one throughout all of history that is closest to God is Moses. And even when Moses wanted to know more about God, all he could do was be in the cleft of a rock, shielded supposedly with God's hand or something, and see his essence as God passes by. If God intended us to know more about God, it seems to me he would have done more than that with the one who was closest to God, which was Moses. And for us now to think that we can use our imagination or whatever to have a greater understanding of God seems to me utterly pointless, considering the relationship that we know of between God and Moses. And we are so much less than that versus knowing God. So I mean, I understand Kabbalists love to do this stuff, but it doesn't have much relevance for me.
Fair enough. That's why we only do this for two sessions. Because there's only so far we can go with it in this kind of a discussion. But today we're going to go in some new directions, a little deeper in this. But I want to give you an example. Oh, go ahead. I'll hold that.
No,
Go
go on.
You sure?
Yes, yes.
So I'll give an example of Jewish sacred imagination. And we're going to take a Bible story that is one of the most incredible stories in the Torah. If you remember the story of Joseph, and Joseph is a dreamer, and he has all these dreams about the sheaves of the wheat bowing down to him, and he becomes hated by his brothers. He's particularly loved by his father, right? His father Jacob, and the brothers, very resentfully, they sell him into slavery. They make it look like he was killed by wild animals in a pit. And almost a generation passes. Jacob is totally aggrieved at the fact that Joseph is gone. And what happens to Joseph? He goes to Egypt, and eventually, through a series of different twists and turns, he becomes the viceroy of Egypt. I'd like to say the minister of the Department of Agriculture. And what happens? There's a famine, and Joseph has now, of course, become acculturated as an Egyptian. He looks like an Egyptian, dresses like an Egyptian. He's an Egyptian in every respect. And his family comes down from Canaan, where the famine is so bad, looking for food. And they come to Joseph, and they don't recognize Joseph. And of course, human nature being the way it is, you would expect perhaps that Joseph, who recognizes them, would feel a sense of revenge or payback. And in fact, in one of the most emotional scenes in the Torah, it says, and Joseph revealed himself to his brothers, and he wept so loud that all of Egypt could hear him cry. And they were tears of joy to be reunited with his family. And what's really, really interesting, this is where we get to Kabbalah. The next thing in the text is, after they describe this wail heard throughout Egypt, you might expect the words next to come out of his mouth to be, "What the heck were you all thinking?" Right? But what Joseph says is remarkable. The first words out of his mouth to his brothers is my father okay? Is my father okay? Now, that is, to me, one of the most remarkable verses in the Torah, because it elevates the humanity of Joseph from the typical, payback, revenge, settling the score that's so common in human conduct. His first concern is my father okay? And I'll just say, as an aside, how many of us during COVID-19 have asked that question: is my relative okay? Is my friend okay? And this notion of the well-being of our families, the people closest to us, as being like really at the heart of the deepest part of our human concerns, comes out of that story. And to me, there's sacred imagination in that. The sacred imagination is that Joseph is characterized as able to transcend the lower dimensions of typical human reaction. And I believe that's what Kabbalah is trying to help us uncover. The difference between the lower, more base reactions to our life experiences versus elevated responses to things that happen in our life experiences. And say, what was it that, Joseph didn't have to be angry. He didn't have to say, what the hell were you doing when you threw me in a pit, and sold me off to slaves? He had grown, he had humbled. And I feel like that's when I talk about, and I think when Daniel Matt is talking about spiritual, sacred imagination, that's what he's trying to get at. The idea that we can imagine higher, more dignified, more spiritual responses to our lives. And, that's say, what was it that God gave humans that in part distinguishes us? And I think Judaism would say it's that. It's the first of all, knowing the difference between the sacred and the profane, between, the compassionate and the apathetic, understanding what it is to aim higher in terms of our choices and our spiritual awareness. And Kabbalah intends to guide a person to greater understanding, and not just understanding, but mastery of these higher aspirations. Anything I just say make any sense? Okay, because these are not things we articulate every day, or even have a chance to talk about every day. But I think that the idea of mastering and developing one's sacred imagination, it's wow, what a nice purpose in life, really. Anybody want to comment on that? Please don't say you're just speechless.
Part of what I hear is, in terms of that story, is the ability to forgive. And in some ways that also goes into that sacred imagination, that you're willing to see something beyond just your hurt. What I was going to say before is that I've been recently watching a program called Revealing the Universe, and it's shows all these incredible things in space and these planets and just how many, talking about how many hundreds and hundreds of universes there are. And as I see these images from the Hubble telescope, I have found myself going, there has to be a God to create all of this. And then I find myself kind of like you with the book of Job and Deuteronomy. I can very quickly go, could one thing have created all of this? And going, and it kind of just imagining, I found myself as I watched this, just kind of imagining all of this being created And what a miracle that is. And without being able to imagine it, it's just there. So I don't know if that.
No, what you say makes a lot of sense. I'll just say one thing. There are a lot of people want to speak, but for example, I've always had a fascination with what in mathematics are called fractals. So fractals are repetitive shapes or variations on certain basic shapes that reoccur both in certain kinds of equations, but most amazingly, reoccur in nature.
Mhm.
And it's interesting, I have a poster on my wall, hard to believe this, but it's a poster for an international conference that took place back in the 60s when they were already talking about greenhouse gases
Mhm.
and impacts on the planet. And on the poster, I can't really show it to you, but on the poster to illustrate the interrelatedness of everything, which was sort of the basis of this conference. They have a picture close up of a fingerprint with the swirl at the center of everybody's fingerprint. Next to that, they have a picture of a swirling hurricane cloud formation.
Mm.
And then next to that, they have a picture of the pinwheel galaxy, which is spinning around in the same fractal shape as the three, from time. And we know, if we've learned even more with the Hubble telescope about the orientation of the galaxies may be in the shape of a DNA molecule. I mean, you hear all this different kind of stuff about things in nature. And when I hear these things and I see these things with my own eyes, it sparks that sacred imagination. To wonder in a good way about these things aren't an accident. These beautiful shapes are not an accident. So yes, now I'll stop. There were some other hands up for sure.
Yes. I don't know why, but what's occurring to me right now is a question that I'm sure somehow can be related to the discussion. But is there kind of, what would you say would be the Jewish attitude toward the arrival of creatures from other planets or from the beyond?
I've never read anything specifically in terms of Torah interpretation that may be referring to otherworldly beings.
Otherworldly beings, yes.
Although, we have a whole tradition of God's messengers, malachim. Angel is not the right word for that. So we certainly have the idea of otherworldly beings connected with God's realm. But there's also something else. Again, the rabbis, the rabbinic period. And remember, we're talking about a period of time, about 1,000 years, starting with the destruction of the temple in 586 BCE, and what became the scribal class in Babylonia and in Jerusalem began to, write and think and try to preserve our stories. And for the next 1,000 years, developed eventually into the rabbinical movement. And there's a saying in rabbinic literature that goes, on the head of a pin there are universes within universes within universes. Now, what is that? I mean, first of all, remarkable that they said it. And what were they aware of, or what were they imagining? I think was, the notion that it's hubris for us to think this world and this universe is all there is, and that it all revolves around us.
Right.
That's one part of the answer. The other part of the answer is, there are a lot of Jewish scholars and scientists that are at the cutting edge of cosmology, and we have been all along. And I think part of what motivates that kind of aspirational science is a sacred imagination. And even Einstein, study Einstein. I used to teach a course on Einstein some years ago. And the thing about Einstein that was so remarkable is that, his greatest insights, derive from dreams and daydreams and thought experiments and out of a sacred imagination. And for him, the idea of a creator, an orderer, was something he never questioned at all, actually. And I've often wondered, we have a guy like Einstein who discovers these relationships in nature, just the simple E = MC squared, and he manages to uncover this relationship and be able to articulate it in mathematical language. And I think, so did God think that up first? Like, did God have that in mind when God put the thing together? And Einstein just uncovered it? Or maybe it's what Einstein uncovered isn't really the truth at all. It's just the level of our knowledge at the moment. I happen to think God wrote that equation first, in some sense.
Rabbi, can you hear us okay?
Yep.
Okay. I have a question. So we've been talking sort of about Kabbalah in these different ways, but I'm really curious because I haven't read the text at all myself. I don't know how many here have, but are you going to be able to show us some examples of text? And I'm curious, do the portions in the Kabbalah, do they retell stories that are in other parts of the Torah, or are they entirely different discussions? What does it consist of?
So I'm going to show you an example. So we're going to go back. Let's see, how do I do this? Hold on. Here we go. Let's move then. Let's just move forward to that. And so the theoretical Kabbalah is based on the Zohar. This, by the way, is a copy of the Zohar right here. And it basically offers a running commentary about the Pentateuch and tries to uncover some meaning. So I'm going to share with you now a section from the Kabbalah. And let's see if you can make sense of it. By the way, it's from the Zohar Chapter 2, page 176. And we're going to look at it together. There was a man who lived in a house, who lived in the mountains. He knew nothing about those living in the city. He sowed wheat and ate the kernels raw. One day he entered the city. They offered him good bread. The man asked, "What is this for?" They replied, "It's bread to eat." He ate it, and it tasted very good. He asked, "What is it made of?" Sorry for the typo. They answered, "Wheat." Later, they offered him thick loaves kneaded with oil. He tasted them and asked, "And what are these made of?" And they answered, "Wheat." Later, they offered him royal pastry, kneaded with honey and oil. He asked, "And what are these made of?" And they answered, "Wheat." And then he said, "Surely I am the master of all these, since I eat the essence of all these, wheat." Because of that, the Zohar says, he knew nothing of the delights of the world, which were lost to him. So it is with one who grasps the principle, but is unaware of all those detectable delights diverging from that principle. So like, what did that just say? What was the point of that story? Here's a guy who grows wheat, and yet he tastes bread, but he has no appreciation of bread. He only understands wheat. Then he gets to have, bread and oil. And he doesn't understand that. He only understands wheat. And then he gets to have royal pastry. And he doesn't understand that because he only understands, or she only understands, wheat. What do you think the Zohar is trying to teach us with this passage? And this is often used as a beginning introduction to Kabbalistic literature, because I can tell you right now, as elliptical as this section seems, this is easy compared to the rest of the Zohar, which is even more complex in the way it's written. But this is an accessible story. What do you think it means? What's the lesson?
Well, Rabbi, for me, what it evokes in me is that this man that was living in the mountains had the essence of wheat and had the nourishment of it, but wasn't seeing the nuances, the joy of being in the world. And that like skinning an onion, there's always layers underneath every one of our experiences.
What's interesting is it's a person living in the mountains who grows wheat, who couldn't imagine bread.
Right. Oh, yes.
Who couldn't imagine, bread and oil, who couldn't imagine fine pastry, all deriving out of the wheat.
Mm-hmm.
And so, again, it's teaching this basic idea in Kabbalah that there are many levels of understanding in this world. And most people live in the realm of the wheat. Never understand, this is a kind of cliche example, but it's just like you go to the grocery store and the food is all prepared and ready for you, with no sense of where it was grown, who planted the seed, who reaped it, who cleaned it, who packed it, nothing. It's just like it appears out of nowhere without a sense of its story. The bread has a story based in the wheat. The bread and oil has a story based in the wheat. The royal pastry has a story based in the wheat. But we often will skip just, either we'll just focus on the wheat, or we'll focus on the royal pastry, but we won't look at what's in between the two.
Mhm.
And Kabbalah tries to teach us how to do that.
This really seems to speak to what Yassine was saying earlier. Maybe I'm not understanding what you said right, but if I understand you right, I kind of, I don't know. I feel like I operate that way in life too, where I try to be more aware and receptive to the other layers, not just my own.
And I also think in a religious sense, one could be secluded away from everyone else and only study, I'll just say it, only study God and really know nothing about her or his creation and the universe around.
Rabbi, just kind of a humorous aside, relating to wheat, the flour mill museum in Arvada had a group of second graders coming through, and the tour guide asked the class, "Where does wheat come from?" Or "Where does flour come from?" And he was looking for the answer, wheat, and the little girl said, "From the grocery store."
Yep,
People
exactly.
have different levels of understanding of the origins of things.
I think the profound lesson in all of this, remember, this was just an introduction to a shtickle of Kabbalah. I think part of the takeaway from all this is that, first of all, Kabbalah teaches us that the universe was created on purpose, that God had to create a space to do that, and did that by contracting, God contracting, Tzimtzum, and in that space, a universe was created, or universes for that matter, and aspects of God were poured in to the universe, and those are we've talked about it, the Sfirot. I can show them to you again. But I think that the real takeaway from what we've been doing here is we need to take the time, and I think it's a choice, it's a conscious choice, to really listen to the stories of others. Because we're living in a time where information is so reductionistic, and we communicate with abbreviations and texts. We sum people up with tiny bits of information. We have now computer algorithms, that track every choice, every purchase, every web search that we do. And now we have machines sizing us up. And I find that extremely scary. I don't think we've even begun to recognize the implications of that in 20, 30, 40 years from now. And it's just, there's no substitution. There's no substitution to listening to a person's real story, with suspending your judgment and just being present and a witness to someone else's life story. And all of a sudden, people discover all these common elements of their sacred imaginations in the process. Um,
Rabbi,
So,
if I could,
yeah, go ahead, Neil. Happy
Oh,
birthday. Happy birthday, Neil.
thank you. Appreciate it. With what you just had in mind, going back a few steps, you kind of shared, the Jewish image per se of God and the Christian image of God, and then you were starting to talk about the atheist image or lack thereof, whatever, of God or a God. And I'm just curious because of my own life, I know that I've, in my maybe more rebellious times, or not that I'm any less rebellious, I've called myself atheist or agnostic, and so how do you see? Maybe just finish your thought on what you're going to say about the atheists.
Well, first of all, atheism and agnosticism are completely different things. Atheism is the absolute denial of the existence of a deity, of a higher being, of a creator. The absolute denial. For an atheist, authority of any sort is temporal. It's the result of, human, social contracts, oligarchy, power, whether it's distributed in democracies or concentrated, with dictatorships, that power in the world and authority in the world is a manifestation of human behavior. And the only things that we can fully accept as real or existing are those that can be proved either through logical propositions or scientific fact. And so, yes, imagination is a tool for the artist. Imagination is a tool for the musician. Imagination is even a tool for a scientist, but it's just a tool. It's just part of the human repertoire. It has no connection to anything beyond our realm. And there's something in atheism that's very solipsistic that says the only reality that is really, countable is the reality between my ears. And if I make connections with people, I do that through language, and language is conventional. If I feel love and affection, it derives from pheromones and all kinds of other physiological reactions or needs. The atheist doesn't account for what I would call the ethereal dimension of the world, or what in philosophy they call the noumenal dimension of the world. And I shouldn't say I have no argument with atheists. I'm willing to talk. I want to talk with atheists. Now, Paul Tillich, the great Christian theologian, he made an argument because, atheists are so dependent on logic as a basis for what they believe about the world. Tillich argued logically with atheism and said that atheism is a fallacy because the absolute denial of anything, Tillich argued logically, is the affirmation of something absolute. And if you can affirm anything that's absolute, then you have to account for the possibility of an absolute being. Now, that was Tillich's logical argument. All Tillich did, and I remember when I took the philosophy of religion in college, we talked about this issue a lot. All Tillich did was argue for the idea of God, didn't argue to prove the existence of God. And so atheists, they deal at a level of what they believe is absolute knowledge, limited by science and perception. An agnostic is different. An agnostic is someone who says, I don't know and I'm not sure. There's no, agnosticism is not about the denial of anything. I happen to believe, and I can tell you when I was a much younger rabbi and I first taught this idea in a Torah class, it caused tremendous consternation. And like it spread like wildfire. Because I make the case that at its heart, Judaism at its best is agnostic. Because Judaism does not deny the existence of God, but at the same time we say, but we can't know who God is. So there's like a deep-rooted spiritual humility in all that says, now I consider myself a Jewish agnostic. I happen to believe in something, but my little kernel of a brain can't fully comprehend what that is. And so I'm willing to say, I believe, but I'm not sure what I believe in. Because Judaism tells me I shouldn't be sure of it. Because Judaism tells me the minute I think I'm sure of it, it's idolatry.
But I mean, even with what you've taught us so far, you talked about the differences in the concept of God between the sort of mainstream Jewish thought today, versus say Kabbalah. I mean, it seemed like last time maybe it was, you somehow there was a concept in there about God being a verb, which has totally stuck with me. And I mean, that is a completely different concept of God than mainstream Judaism. So even within Judaism, is there agreement? I mean,
not at all. Oh, of course not. That's not at all. And that's why, let's remember, there's a difference between God concepts and God moments. And so I can experience awe in the world about all kinds of different things. As I wrote in the message I sent out to everybody, I have God moments doing what we're doing right now. This is a God moment for me. Now, does that mean, now I don't know what exactly that means, but I feel that when we engage with these words and we have these kinds of conversations that are not like everyday conversations, that somehow it's God exists in these moments. And that's me, that's just very personal. But then there are God concepts, which, God is a verb. God created now has nothing to do with it anymore. Pantheism, theism of the Bible. God created and is still involved, and the main way to relate to God is through the mitzvot, the commandments, period, end of discussion. These are God concepts. Different ways of describing the relationship between God. And that's why my argument with Dr. Borowitz was really, for me, was a profound experience with him, because he was the one who was very insistent that, God moments, that's all nice. It's kind of gobbledygook. It's, little kumbaya, and it's, we can all share them in our own different ways. But where the rubber meets the road is when you use the mind that God gave you to describe in logical terms the nature of the encounter. And that is what he believed was theology. And I know that from an academic perspective, he's right about that. But, and then there's inside each person where our God moments and our God concepts, they meet, they intersect, and they change.
Makes me think of an interview that Terry Gross had recently with Mel Brooks.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
Makes me think of an interview that Terry Gross had with Mel Brooks. He's 95, and asking him about his belief in God. And he says, I always figured when I get older, I'll figure that out.
Listen, I love what Betty White had said before she passed away, and people asked her, what do you think about death? And she repeated what she heard from her mother, which is interesting because it's kind of exactly what I heard from my mother and my grandmother. And she said, I'm not afraid of it. I'm going to finally get the answer to the mystery. Embrace the mystery, and that's kind of the agnostic part, I think, of Judaism, which is we embrace a mystery of something we can barely talk about, that is very difficult to describe, and we have no other way other than human language. And the reason Kabbalah, I think, is fascinating is because it tries to describe the divine using poetry and metaphor and symbolism, and just, widens the possibilities of interpretation. And it's not for everybody. It really isn't.
Mhm. I would love to see more passages, see what they say.
Okay. We can put up another passage or two next month, for sure. But I will say that you may come away more confused.
That's okay. That's okay.
And you may come away and say, this is just gobbledygook. And you take it for what it is. But I can put up a couple more passages. But you got a sense from the section I showed you today of how the writing operates. Very much using parables and metaphors and things that are not always obvious.
Yeah.
Now, let's see, there was a question in the chat. John, I think, asked the question, is
It's sacred imagination
sacred
only.
imagination in the Peshat? And the answer is yes. That's why I told you the story about Joseph, and the unlikely response he gives after reuniting with his brothers. That was an example of the sacred imagination in the Peshat, in what was written, just in the story on the surface of the page. Now, before we go, hold on. Gonna bring this up again. And we're going to share. One last thing I want to talk about with Kabbalah by way of introduction. And that is, I want to talk about the feminine aspect of God. The feminine aspect is called Shekhinah. And back to the comment about not referring to God in the masculine. Jewish tradition, particularly in ancient Hebrew, refers to God in the masculine, but the rabbis understood quite clearly that God was not strictly a masculine being, and that there were many manifestations of God in the world, both in nature, through the commandments, through the mitzvot, the Torah, but also talks in Kabbalah about God's presence. And they're talking in very ancient terms about the difference between the transcendent and what's called the immanent. That's like God, the creator, above and beyond and unknowable, and etc. And then there's God that we experience personally in our hearts, like a presence. It's often said that the Torah is written in a way where Yahweh, Yud-He Vav-He, that reference to God is referring to God that's accessible. That's the God that talks to the patriarchs and matriarchs. And then there's Elohim, who's the one on high, so to speak, and beyond. Shekhinah, we're taught in Kabbalah, is the manifestation of the feminine dimension of God in the world, and there are a number of different reference points. I just wanted to mention a couple of them. There is no place empty of Shekhinah, suggesting that actually God's presence is actually everywhere if we shift our perspective to the sacred imagination to welcome that presence into our awareness. So the example I give, and this is what Martin Buber was driving at when he wrote I and Thou, that we can relate to the world around us in a utilitarian way. You know, what can this person do for me? What can this person get from me? How many board feet of wood can I get from these trees in this forest? Everything is in terms of its usable value. But we can also shift our focus, Buber said, so that we're not relating to things as an it, we're relating to things as a thou. And that's relating to things, even a rock on the ground, recognizing that it too has a history, it too has a story. And so when we can relate to the world around us, recognizing everything we encounter has a story, it as a thou, what we're doing is we're recognizing the Shekhinah present in those things we encounter.
Is that another way of talking about that that everything is energy?
It is, but that's not what I think the Kabbalists were intending. The Kabbalists were intending to remind us that in order to see or become aware of the divine presence, one has to shift one's attitude and perspective. Yes, it's about common energy that we can sense in all of creation, but the Kabbalists were saying something else. It was more of a commentary about how we experience the world and what does it take to shift that experience so that sacred imagination is defining our experience of the world. Who had a question?
What is the?
Yep, good. Go ahead.
What is the source of these 5 lives? Is that the Zohar?
The source of the idea of Shekhinah?
No, the quotation.
Oh, you know what? I apologize. I will get all these quotations for you next week. These are from some are from rabbinic literature, and some are from Kabbalistic literature.
The collection.
I like number 4, especially when Rabbi Yosef heard his mother's footsteps, he would say, I will arise before the Shekhinah who is approaching. And felt that, and there is, something about our mother's presence that evokes a sense of the Shekhinah. So I didn't want us to miss that idea of the feminine aspect of God. Any questions before we wrap up for today?
This is
Any-
great.
Thank you so much.
Any comments?
definitely want to thank everyone for being here. It's great to see everyone here.
Happy birthday, Neil.
Happy birthday, Neil.
Thank you.
Happy
And I can
birthday.
tell you're all glazed over after 2 months of Kabbalah. And
No,
we're gonna move forward. We'll have one little tag with Kabbalah next time, and then we'll move forward from here. If anyone wants to study Kabbalah in more depth, just let me know, and I'm willing to work with anyone individually.
I do.
I do too.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom.
Chuck, for joining. Yeah, no, I feel like you gave us like a little toe in the water, you know, and it makes me want to like learn a lot more.
Yeah, I'm open to it.
Yeah, I just felt there's a whole world there. I really would like to understand more of it.
Kabbalah Tuesdays.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Our pleasure.
It's like
Thank
there's a
you,
few
Rabbi.
people, yeah, a few comments here that are saying they would like to.
Yeah, me too.
Okay.
Hillary, I got your message here. Okay.
Wonderful.
Well, enjoy the day and the weekend, everybody.
You too.
You too.
Thank you. Thank you.
Oops, what did I do?
Are we still there?
There we go. We are stopping the recording.